There was something wrong with the new professor. The students noticed before he opened his mouth. He walked into the lecture hall steady and unhurried, with no particular interest in the 80-odd noble sons and daughters packed into tiered rows above him. He carried no notes. He set nothing on the podium. He didn't tug at his collar or smooth his robes the way new faculty always did when facing a room full of wealthy families who paid attention to such things. He stood at the front and let his eyes move across the hall in one long, quiet sweep. That sweep lasted maybe 4 seconds. It looked less like nerves and more like inventory. That was the first thing that didn't add up. The second was his hands. A student in the third row spotted it first and leaned sideways to appear. The professor's knuckles were wrong. The skin over the joints was layered and thickened, the kind of change that comes from striking hard surfaces repeatedly, over years, until the tissue stops trying to heal smooth. His right wrist bore a pale crease near the tendon, the mark of something sharp that had caught him at an angle and won. Those were not the hands of a fallen nobleman who'd spent his career writing spellcraft theory in university libraries. The whisper traveled a few seats and faded. The hall settled back into the mild contempt it had been holding since the faculty announcement. Ludger Chelsea. Disgraced heir of the Chelsea family. Academically unremarkable, politically embarrassing. A man whose appointment to Sarin Academy had apparently come through desperation and a staffing shortage in equal measure. Everyone in this room had already absorbed that summary and filed it away. What happened a few minutes later, nobody fully understood until it was over. A student near the front raised her hand. She had silver hair kept severely back and the measured, flat gaze of someone who had grown up being told she was exceptional and had found no reason to stop believing it. Her name was Flora Lumos, daughter of the Duke, and she told the professor, not rudely because she didn't need to be rude, that she had already completed Tier 3 elemental projection and doubted this course had anything worth her time. The room went quiet in the way it does when 80 people are pretending not to watch. The professor looked at her. His expression didn't shift. He raised his right hand, palm open, fingers slightly curled. He cast a spell. No incantation, no circle drawn in the air, no held breath, no shifted stance. None of the things every student in that room had drilled into their bodies as the necessary cost of even a basic release. Between the moment his hand lifted and the moment a lean tongue of flame appeared above his palm, less than a quarter of a second passed. The fire turned slowly, compact and exact. Then it went out. Flora Lumos stared at the empty space above his hand. 2 rows behind her, someone's pen hit the floor, and nobody reached to pick it up. The professor told the class, in a tone that left no room for debate, that they would begin with the structural logic of cast compression. Nobody whispered after that. But there is something none of those students knew, the thing that would have rearranged every assumption they carried out of that hall. His name was not Ludger Chelsea. Ludger Chelsea was dead. He had been dead for 3 weeks, killed in a burning train car by a bomb he never heard coming. The man now standing before those 80 students had taken Ludger's documents, his appointment letter, and his name from the wreckage before the smoke had finished rising, and done all of it with the practiced calm of someone who had navigated worse situations than this one. This is where that started. 3 weeks earlier, a northbound express rolled out of Thalst border station toward the Duramang capital. The first-class compartments smelled of leather and lamp oil, and the particular quiet that money buys on long journeys. A gray-haired gentleman in a traveling coat occupied one of the 4 seats in a private cabin near the rear, reading a leather-bound journal with his back straight and his left hand loose on the armrest. To anyone watching, he looked exactly like what he was dressed as. An older man of means, mildly bored, passing time. He was not an older man, he was not bored. His name, for this particular journey, was Machiavelli, the alias he used as a war strategist, one of 7 identities he maintained across the continent, each backed by its own documentation, contacts, and history. The silver hair was dye. The slight forward curve to his shoulders vanished the moment no one was watching. He was traveling between assignments, heading north to assess his options before the next role began. A man boarded at the 3rd stop and took the seat across from him with the fussy care of someone protecting a new traveling suit. He introduced himself as Ludger Chelsea, said the name quickly, with the energy of someone proud of it and used to underwhelming reactions. He mentioned Sarin Academy within the first 2 minutes. A teaching contract. Recently confirmed. His voice had the specific lightness of a man who'd received good news and hadn't yet had enough people to share it with. Machiavelli listened. He noted the appointment letter folded inside the man's breast pocket, visible at the corner. He also noted the ring on the man's right hand, a specific cut of dark resin set in tarnished silver, the executive tier mark of the Black Dawn Society. He filed both observations and said nothing about either. They talked for 40 minutes. Mostly Ludger talked. He covered magical theory, curriculum reform, a student from a lecture circuit 2 years back who'd shown unusual aptitude. He was warm and slightly nervous, and genuinely looking forward to something. An hour north of the third stop, the bomb went off. The explosion punched through the rear compartment wall in a single white-orange burst. The pressure wave threw Machiavelli sideways into the curtain and into the wall beyond, and for 3 seconds, there was nothing but heat and a shriek of tearing metal. When the noise dropped to a lower register, crackling, hissing, he pulled himself upright. His left side ached where it had struck the frame. His ears held a flat, high tone. Ludger Chelsea was slumped in the far corner. A fragment of the compartment wall had crossed the cabin at the moment of detonation. He was not breathing. The appointment letter had slid halfway from his pocket in the impact. Machiavelli checked the corridor. Smoke, shouting from the forward cars. The sound of boots on metal as train personnel moved toward the blast. He had perhaps 90 seconds. He was calm. Calm, he had learned across many years and more than one life, was not a feeling, it was a discipline. He took the appointment letter, the identification seal, the Chelsea family signet ring, and a thin logbook of academic notes. He removed the Black Dawn ring from the dead man's right hand and pocketed it separately. He arranged Ludger's coat as decently as time allowed, straightening the collar out of some habit he couldn't have named. He was standing near the compartment door with the correct expression on his face when the first railway officer arrived. He reported what he'd seen. He described the blast. He expressed the appropriate degree of shock. He gave his name as Ludger Chelsea. The military checkpoint at the capital station processed every passenger individually. The bombing had been the third incident on northern rail routes in 6 weeks, and the officers on the platform were working with the thoroughness of people who'd been told, explicitly and recently, to be thorough. When his turn came, the man carrying Ludger's papers stepped up to the table in the slightly stunned manner of a professor who'd survived an explosion and was only beginning to process what that meant. He mentioned the teaching contract twice, because that's what someone genuinely rattled would do. Anchor to the good news, repeat it to make it feel real. The night officer, a wide-shouldered man named Lloyd, with a gray mustache and the deep professional skepticism of someone who'd been lied to by better liars than most, listened carefully. Then he extended one hand palm up and asked for a handshake. Not official protocol. The informal kind of check an experienced man develops. The hand of a clerk and the hand of a fighter feel different. The professor shook it. The grip was gentle, slightly damp, the skin smooth and uncalloused, the pressure behind it modest and untrained. Lloyd released his hand and waved him through. What Lloyd had felt was a thin layer of artificial skin fitted precisely over the real surface beneath, made by a dwarf artificer named Sheridan, who worked for the professor's organization and was very good at exactly this kind of thing. Sheridan had produced it 4 months ago. He'd said, handing it over, that it was his best work given the timeline, though he'd done finer pieces with more time and better materials. He'd said it in the tone of an artist with standards, which he was. The man who was not Ludger Chelsea walked through the gates of the capital and began considering his next problem. Sarin Academy occupied the northern ridge of the city, built into pale stone that caught morning light in a way the original architects had clearly intended, and every subsequent generation of leadership had done their best to obscure with additions. The towers didn't match. The wings jutted at odd angles. From the main road, the whole complex looked less like a unified institution and more like several competing visions of architecture that had been pressed together and decided to coexist. Wilfred met him at the main gate. Wilfred was the administrative secretary, a round-faced man who spoke continuously and with genuine enthusiasm about things most people would have condensed to a sentence. He covered the semester schedule, the student composition, the recent heating enchantment failure in the northern greenhouse, and his own running theory on why that particular greenhouse always lost its enchantment while the others held. He was clearly delighted to have a listener. The professor listened, mapped the layout of each courtyard they passed through, noted 2 exits not visible from the main walkway, and said the things a new hire was expected to say. Principal Elisa Willow's office was on the top floor of the administrative tower. She was already seated behind her desk when they arrived, not making a point of it, just already present, the way people are when they exist in a space rather than enter it. She was younger than he'd expected for a rank 6 mage, with deliberate posture and eyes that moved to a person's face and stayed there. She reviewed his academic record aloud. She told him the practical certifications were below her normal standard, though the theoretical sections were strong. She said this plainly, without softening it. He signed the contract. The salary was, he noted, excellent. She mentioned that the first-year cohort this year included several students with unusually strong early rankings, and that managing a room full of competing egos in a lecture setting could prove difficult. He thanked her for the warning. She watched him for a moment after that, the specific attention of a careful person cataloging something they haven't yet decided how to classify, and then offered her hand. Her grip was precise. Her gaze didn't drop to his knuckles, though he suspected, given what she was, that she'd already assessed more about him than she showed. He would need to be very careful around her. The Monday lecture hall held 83 students. He walked in 2 minutes before the session, which was 60 seconds after finishing a quiet sweep. All visible entrances, the positions of the Academy's 2 on-duty security mages, and the ambient mana reading in the eastern wing, slightly elevated, suggesting either an active enchantment room nearby or someone running a passive signature scan. Possibly both. He set nothing on the podium. The hall's noise didn't die when he entered. It adjusted, the recalibration that happens when a room isn't sure how much attention a new arrival deserves. 2 students in the second row kept their conversation going. A cluster near the side windows was comparing admission casting scores. He waited. He didn't ask for quiet. After about 40 seconds, the volume dropped on its own. People noticed the waiting. The waiting did more than a request would have. He introduced himself and told the class they would spend the session on structural theory, specifically on why every casting method taught at Saren, and at every equivalent institution on the continent, shared a fundamental inefficiency that had gone unchallenged for 4 centuries. A student near the middle, not quite quietly enough, said he'd read Chelsea's published work and hadn't found it particularly innovative. The professor looked at him once, then moved on. He'd memorized the student roster before the first session. Every name, family affiliation, recorded mana attribute. That voice belonged to the 4th son of a marquis from the eastern provinces, 3rd in his admission cohort. Not lacking ability, just unaccustomed to rooms where 3rd place didn't still command deference. Flora Lumos sat in the front row, straight-backed, pen already positioned. She hadn't spoken. She was watching him with the patience of someone who'd decided to reserve judgment while already leaning strongly toward a conclusion. He walked them through the existing casting framework, curve theory, incantation necessity, the geometric multi-layer requirements for circuit stabilization, quickly and cleanly, not as review, but as setup. Then he told them the framework rested on an assumption that was never actually tested. The hall stirred. He explained. The traditional curved circle was not physically necessary for mana regulation. It was historically necessary, because the theorists who first codified casting worked from geometric intuition before mathematical modeling existed, and the curve became standard before anyone had the tools to question it. Applying a structured programming architecture, fixed logical sequences in place of drawn forms, a mage could compress the gap between intent and manifestation to a fraction of the current baseline. The energy signature would look irregular to anyone expecting a traditional reading, but the spell would work. And it would work faster. Flora Lumos asked, with careful precision, how much faster? He raised his right hand, palm open. No incantation, no circle, no preparation visible to the eye. The flame appeared above his palm, before the motion of his hand had finished registering for most people in the room. It held steady, rotating slowly, compact, cleaner at the edge than standard projection, slightly cooler at the core, because the path it had traveled was not a traditional one. He said, 0.24 seconds. Standard Tier 3 elemental projection took between 4 and 7 seconds depending on proficiency. Everyone in that hall knew this. The information landed like a weight dropped from height. No sound, but everything around the impact point shifted. The student who'd dismissed his published work said nothing. Flora Lumos lowered her pen to the desk. She did not write anything. She stared at the space where the flame had been. He moved directly into the theoretical framework, source code architecture, which was what he'd decided to call the method, a term borrowed from a system no one in this world would recognize, from a life that had ended before this one began. He had 3 objectives at Saren. Find the relic fragment believed to be somewhere inside the restricted archives, maintain his cover against both the Academy's administration and the Black Dawn Society's internal communications, and avoid drawing undue attention. 2 objectives were going smoothly. He filed the third as a work in progress. The lecture continued. Flora Lumos eventually picked her pen back up, though she didn't look away from the front of the room for the rest of the session. That evening, he placed 3 items on the desk in his faculty quarters: Ludger Chelsea's personal logbook, the Black Dawn executive ring, and a small dark glass bottle of mana dementia suppressants, the medication that kept the neurological damage from surfacing when he pushed high-tier magic past what his circuits could cleanly handle. Without the pills, overuse triggered headaches that became tremors that became, at the outer edge, a kind of mental dissolution he'd experienced twice and had no interest in experiencing again. The bottle held perhaps a week's supply at his current rate. He shook it once, listened to the rattle, and set it down. Ludger's logbook confirmed what the ring had suggested. The dead man had been more than an academic. The personal notes contained coded references to Black Dawn communication protocols, meeting schedules, a partial list of first-order contacts. The role appeared administrative rather than field-facing, which meant a temporary silence from this alias might pass without immediate alarm, if the right signals went out. He was working on the right signals. He'd sent his associate Hans ahead to watch the South Corridor this evening. Hans was a shapeshifter, cursed by whatever beast had last bitten him to carry some fragment of its nature, and he had the particular gift of becoming invisible in a crowd, not through magic, but through the practiced art of looking exactly like whoever belonged in a space. Tonight he was watching the South Corridor in the manner of a junior groundskeeper heading home after a late shift. The knock that came at 10:30 came from the north side. The professor pocketed the ring, covered the logbook with a mana theory textbook, and crossed to the door. A figure in a plain gray coat stood in the corridor, hood angled forward. It held itself with the stillness of someone trained to occupy minimum space and draw minimum notice. It asked, in a measured tone, whether he was prepared for the relay scheduled for next week. He said yes. Flat voice, familiar cadence, no unnecessary detail, the register of someone confirming something already known, not reacting to new information. The figure studied him, not quite suspicion, the professional skepticism of someone whose job was to be careful about everyone. Then it told him that Order Zero had confirmed the timeline, and that the First Order Executive's ring was to be carried to all meetings without exception. He said he understood. The figure left. He stood in the quiet after the door closed. Building sounds, wind on the eastern face, a faint hum from some enchantment running in the floors below. He had just passed himself off as a dead Black Dawn executive to one of the organization's own couriers. One wrong detail, the ring, the tone, a single misplaced response, and the next visitor would have arrived with considerably less courtesy. He sat at the desk and opened the logbook. There was much to read, and sleep could wait. In the narrow street below his window, a shadow paused under the eave of the building across the way, hands in pockets, watching the Academy's eastern wing in the unhurried manner of someone who'd stopped to think. It looked like nothing worth noticing. It was Hans. He was already working. The days that followed the first lecture settled into a rhythm that suited him. He was careful about that word, rhythm. In his experience, rhythms were what got people caught. They became predictable. They became legible. He kept his schedule varied, different arrival times, different routes between the faculty wing and the lecture hall, meals in the main hall some days, and in his quarters on others. What he couldn't vary was the quality of the teaching. That was a problem he hadn't fully anticipated. His plan had been modest instruction, competent enough to satisfy the Academy's standards, unobtrusive enough to avoid scrutiny. But when you stood in front of 80 students and told them their foundational framework was built on an untested assumption, modest instruction became difficult to fall back on. Flora Lumos arrived at his office on the third day. She knocked once, entered on the second, and sat down across from his desk as if she'd made the appointment weeks ago. She had 3 pages of notes in a precise angular hand that left no margins. She said she'd been working through the theoretical implications of fixed mana sequencing and had identified 6 points where the framework he'd presented contained internal contradictions. He asked her to walk him through them. She did. She was right about 4. The other 2 were errors in her own modeling, which he corrected without dwelling on it. She wrote the corrections over the mistakes without expression. Then she asked directly where he had developed the framework. It wasn't in any of his published work. It didn't trace to any established academic lineage she could locate. She said this not as an accusation, but as a fact she found genuinely curious. He told her he'd been developing it privately for several years. She watched him for a moment. That particular attention a sharp mind applies when something doesn't fit the shape it expected, and then thanked him for the correction and left. He considered her carefully after she was gone. Flora Lumos was going to be a source of ongoing friction. Not hostile friction, which would have been simpler to manage. The friction of an excellent mind pressing on inconsistencies that couldn't be fully explained without explaining everything. He'd need to be deliberate about that. Aiden he noticed later in the week, in the back half of the lecture hall. Most commoner scholarship students in a room full of title heirs developed one of 2 strategies. Make themselves as small and quiet as possible, or perform effort loudly enough to justify their presence. Aiden did neither. He sat near the aisle in the 4th row, wrote thorough notes, and asked questions that were specific and occasionally inconvenient in the way questions from people who are genuinely thinking tend to be. He had a quality Ludger recognized from a long time ago, the particular focus of someone who knows exactly what it costs to be where they are and has decided it's worth paying. After the 3rd session, he stopped Aiden briefly on the way out and asked him to describe his mana attribute. Aiden said it was anti-magic, a rare property that disrupted existing mana constructs on contact. He said it the way people mention features of their life they've been told are a problem, factually, without complaint, with a slight wariness about how it would land. Ludger told him to stay 15 minutes after next session. He wanted to observe his casting posture. Aiden nodded. He didn't thank him, which Ludger preferred. Gratitude before anything was earned had always felt like a tax on time. The first reports arrived from Lethalbelk during the 2nd week. Lethalbelk was the district immediately outside the Academy's southern gate, a neighborhood of student lodgings, supply shops, and the establishments that existed to separate young people with stipends from their money. It was noisy at most hours and largely self-managing, which was why 3 incidents in 5 days pulled attention. The accounts were inconsistent in the way eyewitness descriptions of strange things always are. Something large had broken through the back wall of a storage building near the canal. A man walking home from a late shift had found his route blocked by something that stood upright but moved wrong. A dog 3 streets over had gone silent mid-bark and never made another sound. Hans brought the reports to him on the 4th evening. He sat across the small table in Ludger's quarters, with his boots still wet from a long walk through the lower streets. He said the accounts matched 3 separate sightings across a 4-block radius, which meant whatever was out there wasn't staying put. He said this in the deliberate manner he used when he thought information was about to become a problem. Ludger asked what he thought it was. Hans said he wasn't certain, but he'd found a collar fragment in the alley behind the storage building. Iron, with a manufacturer's stamp he didn't recognize. Not the kind of thing a stray animal wore. Ludger held out his hand. Hans dropped it into his palm. The stamp was a small stylized wheel, a mark he'd seen before, in supply notations inside Ludger Chelsea's logbook. A contracted fabrication run for a Black Dawn-affiliated lab operating somewhere in the city's industrial quarter. He set the fragment on the desk between them and they both looked at it. Hans asked if this was going to become their problem. Ludger told him it already had. He went out alone that night. He moved through Lethalbelk in the plain coat and working boots he kept for situations where being a professor was the wrong thing to be. The streets were thinning past the 10th bell. A few late workers, a patrol of city guards who didn't glance his way. He kept the canal on his left and used the sound of it to cover his steps. He found the tracks around midnight. They weren't animal, not exactly. The gait was close. Depth, spread, weight distribution, but the stride was too long and the path too purposeful. Whatever had made these marks wasn't fleeing or hunting. It was moving with intent. which was worse. He followed them along the freight rail route at the district's edge, where the buildings opened up and the tracks ran exposed for half a kilometer before the station. Good sightlines. No approach cover. 30 meters from the freight station he heard it, a sustained low sound somewhere between a breath and a growl, coming from the shadow behind the eastern loading dock. He stopped. He didn't move his hand toward the mana sequence he was already assembling in his mind. Movement invited reaction. The thing that stepped from the dock's shadow stood 2.5 meters at the shoulder. It had once been human. That was the most disturbing thing. The remnant of that was still visible in the limb structure, the forward orientation of the torso. What the Black Dawn's experimenters had layered over that original form was something else. Plated muscle where muscle shouldn't accumulate. A jaw structure that no longer served speech. Eyes that caught the thin rail lamp light and returned it flat and yellow. It was in pain. He could tell immediately. The movement was wrong in a specific way that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with a body fighting itself. The serum hadn't completed its work cleanly. It never did. He didn't draw it out. He raised his hand and completed the sequence he'd been building since the growl. 0.3 seconds? He was rationing tonight, keeping high-tier constructs in reserve. The spell was precise. The creature dropped without having moved toward him. He stood over it in the quiet of the empty rail yard for a moment. He didn't blame the creature. He knew exactly where to direct that. He noted the direction it had come from and went home. The next morning, Aiden appeared at his office rather than the lecture hall, where the extra session was supposed to be held. He was 15 minutes early and had a younger student with him, a boy named Leo, wide-eyed, nervous, carrying a canvas bag that was moving. Ludger looked at the bag. Aiden said they'd found it near the canal 2 nights ago. He said it with noticeable care, which told Ludger the contents were something Aiden wasn't sure how to describe. Ludger told him to open the bag on the floor, not the desk. What climbed out was small, perhaps half a meter, juvenile by bone structure, with the same mismatched anatomy as the creature at the rail yard, but gentler, less complete. The modifications were still settling into a body that hadn't finished growing. It moved around the office floor in an uncertain circle, sniffed the desk leg, and made a sound too small for what it was, something between a whimper and a hiss. Leo watched it with the expression of someone who had already named a thing they shouldn't have named. Ludger crouched and looked at the cub for a long moment. He thought about the collar fragment on his desk. He thought about what the juvenile would become once the serum finished its work, and what it would feel like to be that, and whether the creature he'd found at the rail yard had been running toward something or away from something when it died. He stood and told Aiden to keep the cub here for now, in the back storage room, away from the main buildings. He said not to tell anyone else. He said it in the tone of someone making a temporary arrangement, not a promise, because he didn't promise things he wasn't yet certain of. Aiden nodded. Leo asked, very quietly, if it was going to be all right. Ludger said he'd work on it. He went to find the lab. It took Sheridan 2 days to trace the manufacturer's stamp to its source. Sheridan operated out of a workshop beneath a pawnbroker's shop in the eastern quarter. A low-ceiling space packed with half-assembled devices and the persistent smell of active chemicals and scorched metal. He was a dwarf, which in this world meant compact, precise, and constitutionally incapable of producing shoddy work even when shoddy would have been faster. Ludger had extracted him from a slave mine in the Eastern Territories 8 months ago, where he'd been worked for his fabrication expertise and given nothing in return. Sheridan had not forgotten this, and he'd also not made a production of being grateful, which suited Ludger well. He cross-referenced the stamp against 3 supplier catalogs and a contact in the materials trade and reported back on the second evening. The stamp belonged to a contracted fabrication house on the northern edge of the freight quarter. The contracts ran through a shell company. The shell company traced back, through 2 intermediary layers, to a holding registered under one name, Lord Belfort Rickon. Belfort Rickon was a minor noble of the Eastern Provincial Courts with a documented interest in backing research projects that required privacy and flexible ethical standards. He had, on record, referred to commoner experimental subjects as operational material. Ludger set the report down. He thought about the cages he was going to find. He thought about Art, the orphan boy in Delica, the factory there, the things he'd witnessed before Delica was behind him. He kept that thought at a distance, because action required distance. and later, there would be time for the rest of it. He went to the lab that same night. The building looked like a warehouse from the street. Inside, past 3 locked doors that Sheridan's bypasses handled quietly, it was something else. Cages, equipment. The clinical organization of people who had decided their work justified its methods. 3 staff members were still on site at midnight. He dealt with them efficiently. Unconscious, not dead. They hadn't been the ones making decisions. He found documentation confirming everything Sheridan had traced. He also found the remaining subjects, 4 of them, in advanced stages of modification, in continuous pain, that the cages did nothing to address. He stood in the middle of that space for a moment with the documents in his hand. He listened to the sounds the cages made. Then he did what needed to be done. Each of them, including the juvenile, which he'd brought from his office in a bag Aiden didn't know was now empty. He walked out of the freight quarter as early workers were beginning to arrive, and the sky was shifting from black to a deep blue-gray. He bought a bread roll from a cart near the canal, because he'd been doing this work long enough to know that eating mattered even when eating felt wrong. He tore it in half out of old habit before remembering there was no one to give the other piece to, and carried it in his pocket the rest of the walk back. Lord Belfort Rickon received an invitation 3 days later. It came through channels that implied a Black Dawn executive wished to discuss the lab's operational future. Rickon arrived at the specified location, a private dining room above a merchant club in the Eastern Quarter, in the manner of a man who believed himself indispensable to people more important than himself. He had the permanent slight smile of someone accustomed to deference, and a way of occupying space that communicated ownership of whatever room he was currently in. The professor was already at the table. The ring made identification simple. Rickon sat down. He wasn't troubled, not yet. He explained, with the smooth confidence of someone preempting criticism, that the lab's operational security had encountered recent complications, but that these were being actively managed and the research program would continue uninterrupted. He talked for 3 minutes. Ludger let him finish. Then he reached into his coat and placed a small vial on the table between them. The liquid inside was the same pale blue-gray as the compound recovered from the warehouse cages. There was no mistaking it. Rickon's expression changed. He began to stand. He didn't finish standing. The professor was very calm about the next part. He said what he had to say once, in simple language. He explained what the serum did once administered. He described the timeline in accurate detail. Not cruel detail, just accurate. He noted the city guards currently positioned outside the Merchant Club's main entrance and what they'd been told to expect when the anonymous disturbance report came in. The transformation, he mentioned, was not immediately fatal. The guards' response would be, he left through the service exit and was back at the academy in time for his 9 o'clock session. The official report, published 5 days later, noted that Lord Belfort Rickon had suffered a severe and unexplained medical episode at a private merchant venue and died in a subsequent conflict with attending guards before the situation could be stabilized. The matter was under investigation. He read this briefly and moved on. He had other concerns. The Rickon incident had, as a secondary effect, severed funding lines for 3 connected Black Dawn operations in Lethalbelk. Useful. But it had also made a particular kind of noise through the society's lower administrative networks, the kind that eventually reached people who paid attention to disruptions in the underground supply chain. One of those people was a woman named Violetta. She managed the Eastern Alley District's informal economy with the methodical efficiency of someone who had learned young that sentimentality was a liability and had spent 20 years being proved right. A burn scar ran from her left jaw to below her ear, which she neither hid nor explained. Hans reported that within 2 days of the Rickon incident, she had correctly identified the opening it created in the Eastern Quarter's underground, and was already positioning herself to fill it. Ludger had been thinking about Owen for some time. The name was a quiet thing, meaningful to no one but himself. He'd been building the framework for 6 months, a cooperative of legitimate and semi-legitimate businesses in the back alley economy, organized on the principle that mutual benefit was more durable than coercion, designed specifically to displace the Black Dawn's grip on the underground trade routes not through direct confrontation but through replacement. Fill the space before anyone else did, and the space became yours. He would need a different name for himself in those rooms. James Moriarty had existed for 2 years before Saren. He'd built the alias for exactly this kind of work. a consulting strategist for criminal operations, someone who solved problems other organizations couldn't solve cleanly. The identity had a reputation across 4 cities and a history that most people who encountered it preferred not to test. More practically, Moriarty had already made certain inroads into the Red Society, which was the largest and least organized criminal network in Lethalbelk's lower quarter. The Red Society's leadership was not the type to respond well to proposals. He factored that in. He wrote 2 letters that evening, in a different hand than his own. One went by courier to Violetta, the other traveled a less direct route to the man currently running the Red Society. Then he set his pen down, capped the ink, and told Hans, who was reading by the window, to be ready in 3 days. Hans asked, without looking up, which version of him he should prepare for. Ludger said Moriarty. Hans was quiet for a moment. He turned a page. Then he said, in the tone of someone who had learned that arguing was usually a waste of time they didn't have, that he'd be ready. The Red Society's meeting place was an underground hall beneath a tannery in the lower quarter. The tannery smell made the air below something between pungent and aggressive, which Ludger suspected was not accidental. Difficult to think clearly when the air is working against you. He arrived as Moriarty. The coat was different, heavier, with a fitted cut and a deliberate severity to it. The posture adjusted to match, something that took up more space, moved with more certainty, carried the specific kind of ease that comes not from comfort, but from having nothing left to prove. It was a different walk than Ludger's, a different set of eyes. 8 men in the hall, 2 of them armed and positioned near the door. The man in the central chair was large and direct in the way men are when size has worked for them long enough to become their primary strategy. He had a reputation for handling proposals personally and briefly. He told Moriarty that he wasn't interested in consultants. Moriarty told him that was unfortunate, and took a seat without being invited. What followed was not, strictly speaking, a conversation. It was a demonstration. Moriarty had spent 2 years building specific leverage points against the Red Society's financial structure, their supplier relationships, and 3 of the men currently in the room. He laid each one on the table in sequence, plainly, without emphasis. He didn't threaten. He simply showed them the shape of their situation with someone who understood it better than they did. The man in the central chair was not stupid. That was actually what made this work. The smart ones recognized the geometry when they saw it. By the end of the evening, the Red Society's leadership structure had been replaced. Not violently. The existing leadership had been given the choice of a buyout or a dissolution, and the buyout had appealed strongly to men whose primary motivation was money rather than power. The new structure fell under Owen's cooperative framework, with Moriarty as its organizing principle and Violetta, who had arrived at the second hour of the meeting with her own proposal already drafted, as its Eastern District coordinator. Violetta had looked at Moriarty across the table for a long moment before she agreed to anything. With the careful assessment of someone who had been misled by capable men before, then she told him her conditions. He agreed to them without negotiation, because her conditions were reasonable and because she would be a better ally than an opponent. She asked him, at the end, why he was offering her an equal stake in something he'd done all the work to build. He told her the work wasn't done, it was just starting. She nodded slowly and signed the framework document Sheridan had prepared. Owen was operational. The Kunst Gallery auction ran once every 2 years and admitted only those wealthy enough to be boring about it. Invitations went to titled families, established collectors, and a handful of foreign dignitaries whose presence lent the event the weight of international significance. Security was handled by the gallery's private force, supplemented by city enforcement. The vault's lower chambers were warded by 2 rank 5 mages on rotating shifts. On the catalog for this season was an item listed as Ancient Reliquary of Disputed Origin, Pre-Imperial Period. The art market's way of saying they didn't know what it was, couldn't verify its history, and planned to charge an enormous amount for it regardless. Ludger knew what it was. The energy signature from the Black Dawn logbook matched it precisely. He attended the opening reception as a foreign collector from the northern Bredos territories, in a coat 3 shades richer than his usual, and glasses he didn't need that altered the angle of his face. Sheridan had prepared the documentation 2 weeks in advance. Hans moved through the event in the uniform of a gallery assistant, carrying serving trays with the absent expression of someone whose mind was elsewhere. cataloging every guard rotation and vault access point while appearing to think about nothing at all. They had 4 hours before the vault's secondary access point cycled to its weak configuration window. The heist ran cleanly through its first 3 stages. Sheridan had planted a ward suppression device in the gallery's ventilation system 2 nights prior, a compact mechanism that reduced the rank 5 ward to roughly half strength for a window of 12 minutes. Manageable. The tertiary access corridor responded to a forged maintenance seal. 2 guards at the vault anteroom were redirected by a fire alarm Sheridan triggered from outside the building. Hans went in first. He was inside 6 minutes when something went wrong. Ludger heard it from the corridor. A sound too large for the space. A grinding impact through the vault wall that vibrated in the floor. Then Hans's voice, strained in a way that landed wrong, calling the code phrase they'd established for one specific contingency. Ludger went in. A private security contractor he hadn't accounted for, engaged by a rival collector who'd tracked the relic independently and wanted insurance, had cornered Hans near the reliquary case. The man had Hans against the far wall with one arm twisted, and Hans had the relic fragment in his free hand, and the wooden dagger from his coat already pressed against his own side. Ludger started moving before he'd finished understanding what he was seeing. Hans drove the dagger in. The curse in Hans's blood was consistent. Whatever beast's fang or claw had last broken his skin dictated what he briefly became. The wooden dagger was a different mechanism, an artifact sourced 8 months ago for exactly this kind of desperate measure. It didn't introduce a new form. It released the largest one already dormant in his system. Something moved from the vault floor upward, a pressure that wasn't quite sound, and then there was no longer a man named Hans in the corner of that room. What stood in his place filled most of the space between the shelves and the ceiling. 8 tails, each distinct in texture and weight. A skull-like structure where a face had been, with phosphorescent light behind the eye sockets. Colossal, and wrong in the specific way that things are wrong when they are very old and should not exist anymore. The security contractor made a sound and stopped being a problem. The relic fragment was still in the grip of a hand that was no longer a hand. Ludger crossed the vault floor and placed his palm flat against the side of Hans's transformed neck, the only anchor point that worked, and began the suppression sequence he drilled until it was automatic. He felt the resistance immediately. Hans always ran deep when the form was serious. 4 minutes. The light behind the eye sockets dimmed by degrees. The structure around it contracted, slowly, returning to something that had recognizable proportions. When Hans came back, he was on his knees on the vault floor, shaking with the full-body exhaustion that followed a deep shift. He said, in a very quiet voice, that he still had the fragment. His hand was wrapped around it so tightly the knuckles had gone white. Ludger took it from him gently and told him to stay down for another minute. Hans said he was fine. Ludger told him to stay down for another minute. They left through the maintenance corridor 11 minutes before the secondary access window closed. Detective Casey Selmoy was waiting outside. Not at the door, she was too skilled for that. She stood at the corner of the loading alley in a plain gray coat, positioned for sightlines on both exits, with the stillness of someone who had been waiting a long time and found it easy. She was young for her rank, with water attribute magic that placed her in the top tier of active field detectives on the continent. Most of her targets learned that too late. She stepped into their path and told Moriarty, which was the name she used because she'd already done the work, that he'd been sloppy this time. He told her she'd misidentified her target. He said it with the unhurried certainty of someone working through a problem rather than reacting to one. She listed from memory 7 international incidents across 4 cities, traced to the same source, the same operational methodology, the same pattern of criminal networks restructured or destroyed in the aftermath. She told him she'd reconstructed his entry route into the gallery from 3 separate evidence chains. She was right about all of it. He didn't tell her that. He told her she was an exceptional detective and that he hoped she'd direct that talent somewhere it could do more lasting good. She moved left, he moved right. The shadow displacement construct he'd prepared earlier activated at the far end of the alley, and in the 2 seconds her attention divided, he and Hans were no longer where she'd last placed them. By the time she'd reacquired the position, the alley held only the sounds of a city going about its business. She stood there for a moment. Hans, describing it later from a rooftop 2 streets over, said her expression was that of someone who was not used to losing and was filing this particular loss somewhere specific. The Sarin Magic Festival arrived in the third month of the semester with the particular organized chaos of an event that required enormous institutional preparation and produced, in its final days, the atmosphere of a building that had forgotten where it put important things. Selena had been organizing her portion for weeks. She was the spirit studies professor, small, gentle, with a laugh that arrived before anything funny had quite finished. She had the slightly distracted quality of someone sharing mental space with someone else, which was, as it turned out, precisely accurate. Ludger had noticed the discrepancy early. Certain hours she moved differently, held herself differently, and occasionally looked out windows for slightly longer than comfortable. He'd filed it and waited. He hadn't intended to enter the faculty tournament. He entered on the second day because Devin Bertag left him no choice. Bertag was a senior elemental professor with the institutional ease of a man who had never been seriously challenged in his own building. 3 days before the tournament, the medical contact who supplied Ludger's suppressant medication had received an approach. The bottle that should have been refilled had not been refilled. The timing was not coincidental. He competed without the medication. He was precise about what he allowed himself to use, the way a man crossing ice is precise about his weight distribution, measuring each sequence, staying inside what his circuits could handle without triggering the cascade. He won his first 2 matches on efficiency. He rationed. Bertag he fought third. Bertag entered the arena with the slight expansiveness of someone who considered the outcome already settled. He was skilled, technically precise, rank 4 deployment, solid fundamentals. He fought well for 4 exchanges. On the 5th, Ludger used a spatial perception bend inside a localized field, something that made the arena's dimensions briefly wrong in a way the eye couldn't process cleanly. Not damage, just wrongness. The kind that tells a perceptive person, immediately, that they have catastrophically misread the situation. Bertag looked at the altered space around him. He looked at the man at its center. He understood then what he'd stolen medication from. The arena went quiet in the same way the lecture hall had gone quiet on the first morning. Ludger stepped out of the field, collected his pill bottle, returned by intermediary 30 seconds prior, and walked to the medical tent without looking back. Bertag did not follow him with anything. What happened during the evening ceremonies was something different entirely. He'd been watching Selena during the opening light summoning display when the quality of her movement changed. A note slightly off pitch. He moved before he'd consciously finished the thought. What shared Selena's body alongside Selena was a woman named Esmeralda, survivor of the Lotan village massacre, an act of casual, noble cruelty that had burned everything she'd known and left enough grief behind for a fire demon to find useful. The demon was called Quasimodo. First Order, rank 6. It had fed on Esmeralda's rage for years, growing larger on a wound that was entirely real and entirely justified. When it surfaced during the festival, it surfaced with the force of something that had been patient for a long time. The first construct it released scattered the outer crowd. The second brought down the festival's light enchantment. Most of the active faculty moved to contain the perimeter. Ludger moved the opposite direction. He found the blind painter Pierre by the Eastern Pavilion, an elderly man who attended every festival, who had painted Selena twice from memory, which was a strange thing to know until it turned out to matter. Pierre's spatial sensitivity, unfiltered by sight, could locate the exact anchor point where the demonic bond held. He told Ludger this in a voice that suggested he'd been waiting for someone to ask. A student named Joanna had stayed near the pavilion rather than running. She was frightened, but she stayed. Ludger gave her a specific and achievable task and she completed it. The 3 of them worked from the anchor outward. Less a fight than a procedure. Methodical severing of what Quasimodo had wrapped around Esmeralda's grief. He used Sephirotic purification in 2 stages. The second stage was heavy enough to trigger the early warning signs of a dementia episode. The edge of a headache behind his left eye, a flicker at the boundary of his vision. He felt it start and he kept working. The purification found Esmeralda at the center and didn't try to remove her. It addressed only what had been feeding on her. What came out of Quasimodo was not quite a monster at the end. It was a large quantity of accumulated grief in temporary physical form. And when the purification burned through it, what remained was a woman who had been carrying something enormous for years and was now only herself. Selena came back slowly, over the following hours, in the medical wing. He visited once. She was sitting up, looking at the ceiling. When she looked at him, her expression was that of someone recalibrating what they understood about the world. She asked if it was over. He told her it was. She said she'd always wanted to go through the festival without keeping part of herself held back, just in case. He told her there would be other festivals. He meant it, which surprised him slightly. The Black Dawn Executive Dream Council convened 6 nights later. The method was in Ludger Chelsea's logbook, a ring activation sequence, performed in low-mana meditative stillness, that established an astral connection between First-Order members regardless of physical location. The meeting space was neither room nor dream, the suggestion of both, dim and pressureless, where figures occupied positions that implied hierarchy without stating it. Order Zero stood at the center, obscured in a way that was clearly deliberate rather than accidental. The presence was large, independent of size. The other executives arranged themselves at careful distances. He took the First Order position and was still. Order Zero moved through the council in sequence: reports, operational adjustments, 2 project timeline revisions. The voice was measured and precise, and empty, in the way voices are when performance of authority has replaced whatever originally sat underneath it. When the floor opened for incident reporting, Ludger, operating under Chelsea's designation, John Doe, raised a concern about the Lethal Belk laboratory disruptions. He framed it as a pattern of interference suggesting either an inside source or an extremely well-informed external actor. He named Detective Casey Selmoy as the probable candidate, citing her investigation profile and operational history. He provided specific, credible details drawn from Casey's public record, applied to situations she had been nowhere near. A pause in the council. The kind of pause that carries weight. Order Zero directed the Lethal Belk investigation toward Casey Selmoy's department. He also mentioned, in passing, that the location of the Prophet of Destiny required resolution before the next cycle closed. He didn't expand on this. The council adjourned. He returned to himself in his own chair, the ring still warm. He set it on the desk. He had just redirected a continent-spanning organization's investigative apparatus toward a detective who was hunting him for entirely separate reasons. It was not comfortable. It was what the situation required. Casey Selmoy appeared at the academy 3 days later on a legitimate consulting warrant, requesting faculty witness statements regarding the festival incident. He answered her questions as Professor Chelsea, mildly, with the appropriate slight distraction of an academic who finds administrative procedure tedious. Toward the end of the interview, she mentioned that his Tier 3 cast time from the opening lecture had been referenced in 2 witness statements connected to an incident near the Kunstgallery on the auction evening. The methodology matched. He said that was an interesting observation. She turned at the doorway. She held a small coin-sized memory relic she'd apparently already activated, a passive capture device, running since she'd entered his office. She said she'd be processing the reading. He told her he hoped she found what she was looking for. She left. He sat with that for a long time. What the relic's reading gave her was not what she expected. The mana signature captured from his office didn't match Ludger Chelsea's recorded mana type. But deeper than that, the high-tier work he'd done in that space had left residuals his suppressants hadn't fully masked. And one of those residuals was old enough and intense enough to carry something imprinted, a fragment of memory locked into a particularly forceful mana discharge. The relic played it back. It played back Delica. He had been there 2 years before the train, working as Moriarty. The reputation was already established, the consulting work already running. He'd taken a room near the university quarter, rough at the edges, underfunded, patrolled by officers who had stopped distinguishing between enforcement and income. Art sold newspapers near the university gate. He was 12 and small for it, with the self-possession of children who've navigated enough uncertainty to stop being surprised by it. He'd taught himself to read from the papers he couldn't sell. He told Ludger once, with complete seriousness, that he had a specific plan to attend the university in 4 years, mapped step by step on a piece of paper he kept folded in his coat. He showed it to Ludger once. It was meticulous. They talked most mornings for 3 months. Ludger brought a better coat when autumn came, a vocabulary book from the used bookseller's row. Art received these without performance, the way children accept practical things when they understand what practical things are worth. He wasn't supposed to get attached. He knew that. He'd known it for years. The corrupt officer network in Delica had been running a trafficking operation out of the industrial quarter, moving children under the cover of an automaton factory that ran legitimate business on the upper floors and something else entirely below. Ludger had been dismantling it carefully, from the outside in, for 2 months. He wasn't quite finished when they came for Art. He arrived at the alley behind the newspaper stand, 20 minutes after the last time he'd seen the boy. 20 minutes too many. 2 officers. An accusation that required no evidence because the officers were the evidence. He arrived to aftermath. He stood in that alley for a very long time. What followed was not calculated the way his usual work was calculated. It was faster, harder, and considerably more thorough than the plan had called for. He dismantled the trafficking network in 4 days instead of the remaining 4 weeks. That pace cost him 2 dementia episodes and 11 days of recovery. He would not have said, looking back, that he would have done it differently. The factory's lower floors held something he hadn't anticipated: a completed automaton chassis, alongside a soul transfer mechanism the factory had been developing under Black Dawn direction. The technology was functional. It had been tested. He stood in that space and thought about the folded piece of paper. What he did next was not in any plan. He did it because the alternative was leaving something unfinished that he was not capable of leaving unfinished. The automaton that walked out of that factory was small, built to a child's proportions, copper-jointed, with glass lens eyes that caught light in a way that wasn't quite biological and wasn't quite not. He named it Arfa. He did this quietly, in the empty factory, before anyone else arrived. Art's folded paper was inside the chest cavity, behind the primary relay core. He closed the panel. Casey Selmoy watched the memory fragment 3 times. After the 3rd, she sat very still. Then she opened her own case files, the international incidents she'd cataloged, the methodology she'd mapped, the consistent pattern of trafficking networks dismantled in 4 cities across 2 years. She reviewed the Kunst Gallery report. She reviewed the Delica files under the Moriarty classification, with the red flag attached. She found, in the Delica material, the record of her own near-death at Reichenbach Falls, a confrontation on the cliff structure at the waterfall's edge, at the end of the factory raid. She remembered the fall. She remembered the water. She did not remember who had pulled her out. The residual memory answered that. She sat with the answer for a long time. She was thorough and she was good at her work, which was exactly why this was difficult. The good ones, when they found a genuine contradiction in a case they'd built carefully, had to follow it wherever it led. She had built this case over 2 years. She had been certain. She was following the contradiction. She didn't know yet where it ended, but she was following it. In his office at Sarin Academy, a professor who was not Ludger Chelsea marked a stack of theoretical exercises with a red pen and the quiet of a building settling into evening. The first relic fragment was locked in his desk drawer. The second was somewhere in the restricted archives. Arfa was in Delica, in the care of a contact he trusted. Hans was recovering in the lower city. Sheridan was in his workshop. Violetta was running Owen's eastern quarter. Order Zero was looking for the Prophet of Destiny. He didn't yet know what that designation meant for him personally, but he knew it was the kind of phrase that eventually stopped being abstract. Casey Selmoy was reconsidering everything. Principal Elisa Willow had scheduled a private meeting with him for Monday morning. The tone of the request, delivered through Wilfred, had not been casual. He uncapped his pen and continued grading. The evening bell crossed the academy, deep and even, and the city beyond his window went about its business, full of people who had no idea what was being managed quietly in the rooms above them. He had always preferred it that way. Quiet work, no applause, just the slow, deliberate dismantling of the things that needed to be dismantled, one careful step at a time, under a name that wasn't his. He turned the next page.